we are going to build big. Because we're going to build big and build often, it's a little more than $80 billion between now and the end of the decade. Now, as much as possible, we will concentrate that on areas where there is dual use applications. AI is an example, critical minerals is another example, decarbonization, a number of those technologies are there.
Mark Carney has just delivered one of the most revealing interviews of his premiership, and it exposed something Washington did not expect. While Donald Trump has spent months trying to force Canada back into dependency through tariffs, intimidation, and economic threats, Carney calmly sat on stage in Calgary and explained, with almost unsettling composure, exactly why those tactics have no hold over Canada anymore. There were no theatrics, no raised voices, no political jabs, yet somehow the quiet tone made the message even louder. Canada has moved on, Trump's leverage is shrinking, and the world has begun to notice. This video breaks down how a single interview revealed why Trump's pressure strategy has failed and why Canada is entering a new phase of strategic independence that Washington can no longer ignore.
So when you look at it from an energy perspective, we start with our strengths, oil and gas, conventional, but also the innovations that we've done. We have one of the cleanest grids in the world, 80% plus clean power across the country, hydro, nuclear at the core of that. We have the ability to double, possibly triple that over the course of the next 15 years.
What was supposed to be a standard conversation about LNG, energy grids, and infrastructure quickly turned into a declaration of direction for Canada. Carney confirmed that Canada intends to double its non-U.S. exports by 2030 and expand its energy capacity across LNG, nuclear, hydro, low-carbon oil, and hydrogen. He spoke about building an AI ecosystem that isn't dependent on American hyperscalers, a national research architecture strengthened by a $1.7 billion plan to attract top global researchers, and a broader industrial renewal built on critical minerals, domestic processing, and applied R&D. The moment that sent shockwaves through policy circles in Washington came when Carney said, almost casually, we do need to have greater diversification. He made it clear that although the United States remains an important partner, Canada is no longer willing to hinge its economic future on a country whose trade policy changes with every political mood swing. Trump believed Canada had no choice but to accept Washington's demands, but the interview revealed that Canada has already built the escape routes and is walking through them confidently.
For more than a year, Trump has tried to drag Canada back into economic submission by weaponizing tariffs across steel, autos, clean energy components, and lumber. His team assumed that Canada, deeply tied to the U.S. market, would eventually fold. But Carney's interview showed that those tariffs didn't weaken Canada, they accelerated its pivot away from U.S. dependence. Canada used the turbulence to justify an ambitious industrial overhaul. Ottawa accelerated critical mineral development, unlocked new LNG export corridors, negotiated new trade pathways across Asia and Europe, and secured deeper partnerships with South Korea and Japan. Instead of intimidating Canada, Trump inadvertently pushed it to diversify faster than at any point in the last 40 years. It is difficult to overstate the miscalculation. Trump expected fear. Instead, he sparked strategy. Carney's explanation of Canada's future energy landscape was perhaps the most damaging blow to Washington's assumptions. He described a country with one of the cleanest grids on the planet, powered by hydro and nuclear, and capable of doubling or even tripling its clean generation capacity. He spoke of LNG projects built on low-carbon foundations, hydrogen pathways being commercialized, nuclear expansion underway, and interprovincial energy corridors that would reshape the national grid. In contrast, the United States under Trump is swinging between extremes, blocking offshore wind projects, undermining clean energy credits, and igniting uncertainty for renewable developers. Carney positioned Canada as the dependable supplier in a world that is desperate for stable, low-risk energy. Reliability, not volume, is becoming the new currency of global power, and by that definition, Canada is rising just as the U.S. is becoming more unpredictable.
A recurring theme in Carney's interview was the quiet but decisive shift happening in Canada's resource strategy. Instead of exporting raw materials and letting other countries control processing, Canada is now building its own processing capacity, especially in Quebec and Ontario. This reduces dependence on China, but has an equally profound effect on Canada's relationship with the United States. It eliminates one of Trump's favorite pressure points. Washington has long assumed that Canada needs the U.S. market to monetize its mineral resources. But by controlling both the extraction and the processing, Canada no longer has to accept American terms. Mineral supply chains backed by G7 partnerships and EU investment give Canada more choices and fewer vulnerabilities. Trump can tariff aluminum or steel, but he cannot tariff an industry Canada now controls from the ground all the way up the value chain.
One of the most striking moments in the interview came when Carney acknowledged that Canada historically loses many of its best AI graduates to the United States. But instead of accepting this as inevitable, he laid out a plan to reverse the trend, a new productivity superdeduction that makes R&D and data infrastructure far more attractive inside Canada. A Canadian DARPA-style agency called Borealis, a billion-dollar competition to attract 1,000 world-class researchers, and a strategy to lure highly skilled workers who are frustrated by U.S. visa chaos. In other words, while Trump erects barriers, Carney is opening doors. The U.S. is shrinking its talent pool, Canada is expanding its own. And in the global competition for AI leadership, the country that attracts the most minds wins, not the country that yells the loudest.
Carney ended the conversation with a line that summarizes the new era Canada is entering. We are going to build big because we are going to build big and build often. He was talking about community infrastructure, energy megaprojects, national grids, ports in Nunavut, training centers, and the trades-based workforce needed to build a new generation of national assets. But behind the policy detail was a deeper message. Canada is no longer waiting for Washington's permission to grow. It is building its own economy, its own export routes, and its own technological base, and that means Trump's leverage is evaporating. The United States can pressure a dependent country. It cannot pressure a self-sufficient one.
Carney's interview wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, it didn't attack Trump directly, but it didn't have to. The quiet confidence of his answers revealed that Canada is entering a phase where U.S. pressure simply doesn't work anymore. With a diversified export strategy, a rising clean energy platform, a controlled mineral supply chain, a revitalized research ecosystem, and a talent strategy that turns America's immigration turmoil into Canada's opportunity, the old dynamics no longer apply. So the real question, and the one Canada's allies and rivals are now asking, is simple. If Canada continues to rise at this pace, what happens when Washington realizes it no longer holds the senior partner position in this relationship? Canada's transformation has already begun. Trump just hasn't caught up to it.
President-elect Donald Trump's comments about one of Canada's most valued natural resources.
We have millions of gallons of water pouring down from the north with the snow caps in Canada and all pouring down. And they have essentially a very large faucet.
Donald Trump has made many provocative claims throughout his political life, but few have struck Canadians more deeply than his suggestion that the United States should one day access Canada's freshwater reserves. And for many in Canada, the moment felt familiar because Trump's fixation on Canada is not new.
I love Canada. Frankly, Canada should be the 51st state.
His earlier comments about turning Canada into America's 51st state reveal just how casually he imagines Canadian territory and resources as extensions of U.S. interests.
It's not for sale, won't be for sale, ever.
Prime Minister Mark Carney pushed back with one of the clearest statements of his leadership so far. Canada is not for sale. It was a declaration of sovereignty aimed directly at Trump, and it carried an unmistakable nuance.
a quiet but firm reminder that Canada values the integrity of its territorial sovereignty, and that includes its water. These are not assets that can be casually claimed, politically pressured, or folded into someone else's agenda. This isn't a normal cross-border argument. It's a preview of a much larger struggle looming over North America, a struggle shaped by tariffs, trade leverage, climate instability, resource scarcity, and the hard limits of what even a superpower can demand from its closest ally.
The controversy resurfaced when Trump's earlier remarks began circulating again, comments painting Canada as a country with millions of gallons of water pouring down like a giant faucet, and hinting that the United States should eventually secure long-term access to that supply. With the American West deep in another year of extreme drought, those words landed differently. States like Arizona, Nevada, and California are approaching the limits of their water systems after years of shrinking snowpack, collapsing reservoirs, and relentless heat. Lake Mead hovers near historic lows, the Colorado River is under unprecedented strain, and major cities from Phoenix to Las Vegas are spending billions on recycling and desalination just to keep pace. In that increasingly desperate environment, Trump's idea resonates with some Americans who see Canada as a land of endless lakes and untapped rivers. U.S. commentators and policy groups have begun reviving old visions of continental water pipelines and cross-border water-sharing agreements, framing Canada as a natural solution to America's drying future. But in Ottawa, the reaction followed a very different logic. The renewed talk of accessing Canadian water fit neatly into a broader pattern, the same pattern seen in Trump's 51st state rhetoric, where Canadian territory and resources were spoken of as if they could be absorbed into American plans. Carney avoided the theatrics this time, but his stance remained unmistakably consistent. Canada's sovereignty is not for negotiation, and that principle extends fully to its natural resources. Ottawa made clear that Canada alone decides how its land and its water are used, not Washington, and certainly not the political imagination of any U.S. administration.
The desperation gripping the American Southwest is well documented. Reuters, AP, and NOAA all show a structural decline in water availability, shrinking reservoirs, shrinking farmland, and cities negotiating seasonal survival. In that setting, the idea of drawing water from Canada feels increasingly logical to many Americans who see Canadian lakes and rivers as an untapped surplus. Trump's language amplifies that belief by framing Canadian water as if it were simply flowing across a border waiting to be shared. Policy groups in Washington have even revived old proposals for continental pipelines, borrowing the mindset that built North America's oil and gas networks. If energy can move across borders, why not water? For Canada, that logic is not just flawed, it sets a dangerous precedent. Canadians have long rejected the myth that the country has limitless water. Scientific assessments from the University of British Columbia, Statistics Canada, and Environment Canada all point to the same conclusion. The majority of Canada's fresh water is not renewable, not easily accessible, and not available in the quantities outsiders imagine. Much of it sits in northern regions, far from population centers or locked inside glaciers that are themselves shrinking. Carney knows this scientific reality. He also knows the political one. Canada has spent decades defending its natural resources, lumber, dairy, minerals, and energy, against American trade challenges. The moment something becomes an export commodity, the rules change. Corporations gain leverage, international trade law becomes involved, and the United States, with its massive political and economic weight, gains new channels to push for access. That is why, even without the dramatic phrasing, Carney's position on water was unmistakably tough. When he pushed back against Trump in the 51st state moment, he wasn't just defending national pride. He was defending the principle that Canada, not Washington, decides what Canada is. Today's water issue is simply another attempt to draw Canada into an American frame, and Carney responded by reminding everyone that Canadian resources exist under Canadian governance. Even if Canada entertained the idea, the environmental toll would be severe. Freshwater systems are interconnected and fragile. Redirecting water from one basin to another risks destabilizing fish stocks, draining wetlands, and permanently altering river flow. Canada's major watersheds, from the Great Lakes to the Mackenzie, already face mounting pressure from rising temperatures and industrial expansion. Scientists warn that once large-scale exports begin, the political and economic momentum becomes nearly impossible to reverse. What starts as a temporary solution can harden into a permanent obligation, backed by infrastructure and cross-border expectations.
Climate change is reshaping geopolitics, and water is emerging as the new pressure point. Trump's second-term agenda already strains Canada through tariffs on steel, aluminum, autos, lumber, and agricultural goods. Water, even if not formally demanded, now sits in the background as a strategic interest the U.S. may pursue as drought deepens. Carney's approach seeks to close that door before it becomes a negotiation. By grounding the debate in sovereignty rather than emotion, he reinforces Canada's political position and connects today's issue to past provocations like the 51st state remark. It sends a clear message: Canada will not be redefined by American expectations or political fantasies.
The clash between Trump and Carney over water is not a trivial dispute. It is a first chapter in a future where nations will battle not over trade deals or tariffs, but over fundamental resources that determine survival. Canada's stance reflects a deeper strategy: protect what must be protected now before climate pressure turns questions into demands. The United States will continue facing a worsening water crisis, and its leaders, Trump or otherwise, may return to Canada with new proposals. The real question is how Canada prepares for that moment and whether it can safeguard its sovereignty in a world where water is emerging as the most strategic resource of the century. It was a moment that few in Washington expected to see. As Prime Minister Mark Carney stepped onto the red carpet in Kuala Lumpur, ASEAN leaders rose to greet him with applause. Cameras captured a rare sight: Canada at the center of an Asian summit, welcomed not as a visitor, but as a partner. For months, the United States had been raising tariffs, tightening borders, and warning its allies to follow suit. Yet here was Canada, doing the opposite, expanding outward, talking trade, energy, and cooperation. What happened in Malaysia was more than a diplomatic stop. It was a declaration that Canada intends to shape its own future, even if that future no longer revolves around Washington.
We laid out last week that we want to increase our non-U.S. exports by 50% within the next decade. Shorter time frame than that. It's about $300 billion to give context to that.
That's a good thing for Canadians to understand, that we're not just on bended knee hoping that Donald Trump will stop doing things that don't make any sense. We're not going to rely on the Americans anymore because they've turned out to be very unreliable, at least under the current administration. So
Carney's trip to Asia was his first as Prime Minister, and he chose the ASEAN summit in Malaysia for a reason. Canada wanted to send a clear message: it is ready to engage directly with the fastest-growing region on Earth. The reception could not have been warmer. Regional newspapers described Canada as a dependable new voice in an uncertain world. In the summit hall, delegates highlighted Canada's consistent support for a rules-based system and fair trade. It was a contrast to the transactional tone that has defined U.S. policy in recent years. ASEAN represents a market of more than 650 million people and a combined GDP exceeding $4 trillion. According to the International Monetary Fund, the region is projected to grow around 4.5% in 2025, making it a crucial partner for any nation seeking long-term economic stability. For Canada, which still sends roughly 75% of its exports to the United States, Statistics Canada 2024, the opportunity was obvious. Carney framed the visit as a turning point, a chance for Canada to connect its advanced industries with Asia's demand for energy, minerals, and technology. He described Canada as a nation that shares ASEAN's values of inclusivity and sustainability. Behind the diplomatic language was a simple truth: Canada was ready to diversify, and Asia was ready to welcome it.
Carney laid out a measurable plan. Within 10 years, Canada aims to double its non-U.S. exports by 300 billion Canadian dollars, much of it from Asia. The foundation is energy and innovation. Canada is one of the world's top LNG producers, projected to export 50 million tons annually by 2030. Meanwhile, 85% of its power grid is clean, with expansion focused on small modular nuclear reactors and renewables by 2035. Canada is also advancing in critical minerals through a critical mineral alliance linking its vast resources to Asian demand. The 2025 federal budget pledged to quadruple defense and tech spending over 5 years, prioritizing AI, cybersecurity, and advanced manufacturing. Together, these measures form an industrial strategy that combines energy security, clean technology, and digital strength into one national vision.
While Carney was being toasted in Kuala Lumpur, the atmosphere in Washington was tense. President Trump had just threatened another round of 10% tariffs on Canadian imports, citing unfair trade practices. The intention was to pressure Ottawa into compliance. Instead, it triggered something else: acceleration. Canada's pivot to Asia has become a direct response to the very trade barriers meant to contain it. When the U.S. closed its doors, Canada opened new ones. Trade analysts from the Peterson Institute in Washington noted in early October 2025 that tariff escalation is diverting investment and supply chains toward non-U.S. partners. That shift is already visible in the data. According to Global Affairs Canada, exports to Indo-Pacific economies reached 261 billion Canadian dollars in 2024, and new agreements signed with the European Union, Japan, South Korea, and now ASEAN could raise that number by hundreds of billions more within a decade. Every deal reduces the share of Canadian trade tied to the U.S. market. For Washington, this was never part of the plan. Trump's America First approach was supposed to strengthen the U.S. position within North America. Instead, it weakened it. By relying on tariffs as leverage, the administration pushed allies to seek alternatives. The result? Canada is no longer the quiet neighbor adapting to U.S. rules. It is emerging as an independent trade power with its own network across the Pacific.
Carney's vision defines Canada as a nation connecting Western systems with Asia's fast-growing markets. This approach is already reflected in policy. Canada's trade frameworks mix Western transparency with Asian flexibility, supporting carbon pricing and clean energy standards while offering financing models suited to ASEAN economies. By stepping into this space, Canada fills a gap left by Washington's retreat. Leaders across Asia see Ottawa as modern, predictable, and open to practical cooperation. The challenge now is to balance principles with pragmatism, a balance that makes Canada newly relevant in 2025.
The symbolism of this trip resonated far beyond Asia. In Europe, financial newspapers described it as Canada's diplomatic breakout. In Ottawa, economists pointed out that the strategy mirrors global trends: diversification, regional blocs, and the rise of mid-sized powers shaping their own paths. The Financial Times reported on October 24th that Carney's Indo-Pacific initiative could attract over 500 billion Canadian dollars in combined public and private investment over the next decade. That figure aligns with Ottawa's internal projection of a $500 billion growth plan, an ambitious but realistic target given Asia's scale. These moves are changing how global investors see Canada. Once considered an extension of the U.S. economy, it is now viewed as a Pacific gateway for Western capital. The Toronto Stock Exchange's index of resource and tech firms has outperformed the S&P 500 since mid-2025, partly due to optimism over Asian demand for Canadian minerals, energy, and clean tech components.
Every handshake in Kuala Lumpur and every announcement in Singapore sends the same message. Canada intends to lead through partnership, not confrontation.
As the ASEAN summit concluded, Carney stood alongside regional leaders beneath the bright stage lights, smiling as the cameras flashed. It was more than a photo opportunity. It was the image of a country quietly transforming its role in the world. Back in Washington, the reaction was muted but unmistakable. Commentators on major networks admitted that America's tariff strategy might have backfired. Canada, once seen as a secondary player, had turned adversity into opportunity. The shift is profound. By choosing collaboration over conflict, Canada has begun to build a new identity, one grounded in confidence, partnership, and independence. It is no longer waiting for permission to act on the world stage. In 2025, while America isolates itself behind its own barriers, Canada is walking into Asia's open doors. The question now is not whether this pivot will succeed, but how far it can go. Because in the global race for influence, this may be the year when Canada finally stops following and starts leading.
And Canada called me a couple of weeks ago. They want to be part of it. To which I said, well, why don't you just join our country? You become 51, become the 51st state, and you get it for free.
Canada does not shrink from global challenge.
Well, I disagree with anything that guy says. He drives me crazy.
At the end of September, 2 speeches revealed how wide the gap has grown between Washington and Ottawa. In Quantico, President Donald Trump stood before military leaders and celebrated America's new missile defense project called the Golden Dome. He described it as the most advanced shield in the world and then pointed to Canada. According to Trump, Ottawa wanted to join, but his reply was blunt: "Become the 51st state and you get it for free." Meanwhile, in New York, Canadian Foreign Minister Anita Anand told the United Nations that retreat is not an option and Canada will not turn inward. The contrast could not be sharper. Trump frames tariffs and security as bargaining chips, while Canada insists on independence and global engagement. This is the stage on which the tariff battles are now playing out. Since returning to the White House in January 2025, Trump has rolled out a new wave of tariffs that even America's closest allies did not expect. Lumber, kitchen cabinets, heavy trucks, and branded medicines have all been swept into the tariff net. For Trump, these moves prove toughness. For allies, they send a message that friendship does not mean exemption. The administration argues that the strategy is already paying off. In his Quantico speech, Trump claimed that the United States attracted $17 trillion in new investment in just 8 months, a figure he contrasted with the lack of inflows under President Biden. The claim reflects the mood at the White House, where tariffs are seen as leverage to pull factories, auto plants, and technology hubs back to U.S. soil. Yet the economic picture is more complicated. Industry data show that roughly 80% of upholstered furniture and about half of cabinets sold in the United States are imported. Tariffs in these areas raise costs for builders, retailers, and households. Families already burdened by mortgage rates above 6% now face higher renovation costs. The short-term boast of investment is shadowed by higher prices and mounting frustration among partners. Canada's answer is to move in the opposite direction. Standing before the UN General Assembly, Anand insisted that Canada will continue to strengthen multilateral institutions and remain a stable partner in both business and security. That message reflects a clear strategy. Ottawa has accelerated trade diversification with the European Union, Indonesia, Mexico, and the United Kingdom. New resource projects in cobalt, nickel, and lithium are positioned as anchors for an independent North American supply chain that does not rely solely on U.S. approval. The Ontario government's September pledge of $17.5 million Canadian dollars to support North America's first cobalt refinery alongside U.S. and federal contributions shows how Canada is using global demand for critical minerals to build leverage. By presenting itself as a reliable, rules-based partner, Canada turns the pressure of American tariffs into momentum for new alliances.
Instead of being cornered, Ottawa is carving out space to act on its own terms.
Taken together, these developments reveal the cost of Trump's approach. The United States is projecting strength through tariffs and investment claims, but it is also straining ties with allies. Canada is not folding. It is using the moment to reposition itself as a defender of international rules and a hub for new trade. Trump's line about Canada becoming the 51st state may have been delivered for effect, but it underscored how Washington sees tariffs and security as one package. For Canadians, that package looks more like a warning than a partnership. Tariffs can deliver headlines and temporary wins, yet in practice they risk driving allies away. The question that remains is whether this strategy will secure America's dominance or whether it will backfire by pushing countries like Canada to seek independence in the global order.